A scarred drifter wandered into Silver Peak with nothing but a worn-out coat and a hidden past. What the town's ruthless gang didn't know was that they were about to corner the deadliest marksman of the Civil War, a man who hadn't missed a shot in 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Silver Peak's dusty streets as Nathan Crawford adjusted his hat brim lower, concealing the distinctive scar near his right eye. The mining town's wooden buildings creaked in the warm breeze, their weathered facades telling stories of better days. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was dying. Fewer people meant fewer questions about his past. The Sweetwater Saloon's batwing doors slammed open as three men stumbled out, their raucous laughter cutting through the evening quiet. Crawford noticed their gun belts first, worn high and tight, the way men who used them regularly preferred. The shortest one, sporting a decorative bull whip coiled at his hip, couldn't have been more than 20. "Hey there, stranger," the young man called out, his words slightly slurred. "Ain't seen you around these parts before." Crawford kept walking, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each measured step. Experience had taught him that trouble often started with simple greetings like these. "William?" A woman's voice rang out from the saloon's entrance. "What did I tell you about harassing travelers?" Crawford paused, turning slightly. Isabella Steele stood in the doorway, her black dress and confident posture marking her as someone of authority. The three men straightened immediately, their drunken swagger replaced by something closer to military discipline. "Just being friendly, Belle," William Turner replied, though he took a step back. "My apologies, sir," Belle said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Silver Peak can be unwelcoming to newcomers, but we're working on our manners." She studied Crawford's worn duster and the absence of visible weapons. "Are you looking for work? We might have something suitable for a man of your disposition." Crawford touched the brim of his hat. "Appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I'm just passing through." "Shame," Belle replied. "Well, if you change your mind, Sweetwater's the place to find me." She turned to her men. "Roland, Lucas, get William sobered up. We've got business to discuss." Crawford continued down the street, aware of the eyes following him. He'd learned long ago to read a town's pulse within the first hour, and Silver Peaks was racing. The tension in the air reminded him of battlefields just before the shooting started. He found the general store near the end of the main street. A small bell announced his entrance, and Sarah Lynn looked up from her ledger. The Chinese shopkeeper's eyes widened slightly at his appearance before she composed herself. "Welcome, sir. What can I help you with?" "Coffee and hardtack, if you have it," Crawford replied, placing a worn coin on the counter. "And information, if you're willing to sell that, too." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the closed door. "Information can be expensive here, especially about certain people." The woman at the saloon, Belle Steele. Miss Steele and her associates. Sarah chose her words carefully. They came 6 months ago, after the silver strike proved smaller than hoped. Most folks had already left, but they saw opportunity here. She wrapped the coffee and hardtack in brown paper. They protect the town, they say. But their protection comes with a price. The bell rang again, and Samuel, Doc Mason, entered, his medical bag in hand. The older man nodded to Crawford before addressing Sarah. "Those supplies have come in yet? A patient needs tending." "Tomorrow's stage, Doc. Mr. She looked at Crawford questioningly. "Smith," he supplied, knowing the lie wouldn't hold long. "Mr. Smith was just leaving," Sarah finished, sliding his purchases across the counter. Crawford took the hint and headed for the door, but Mason's voice stopped him. "Hold on there, son." The doctor's eyes narrowed, studying Crawford's face. "Have we met before? Something about you seems familiar." "Don't believe so," Crawford replied, though he recognized Mason from the field hospitals at Antietam. The doctor had been there the day Crawford earned his scar, and his reputation. "Huh," Mason muttered. "Must be thinking of someone else. Though I will never forget a face, especially one with..." Crawford was already through the door before Mason could finish. The sun had dipped below the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. He needed to find lodging for the night and then move on before anyone else started remembering faces from the war. A whistle pierced the evening air. Turner and the other two men from the saloon had positioned themselves at different points along the street. Behind Crawford, Belle Steele emerged from between two buildings, a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms. "You know," Belle called out, her earlier friendliness gone, "it's considered rude to use a false name in polite company, Mr. Smith. Or should I say, Ghost?" Crawford stopped. It had been years since anyone had used that name. His reputation from the war earned one impossible shot at a time. He'd left that life behind in the blood-soaked fields of Virginia, or so he'd thought. "Doc Mason has an excellent memory for faces," Belle continued, "especially those belonging to famous Union Army sharpshooters. The question is, what brings the legendary Ghost to my quiet little town?" Crawford slowly turned to face her, keeping his hands visible. "Like I said, just passing through." Belle's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Nobody just passes through Silver Peak anymore. Roland, Lucas, escort our guest somewhere more private. We need to have a longer conversation about his intentions." The two men advanced, confidence born of experience with unwilling targets. They clearly expected another drifter down on his luck, maybe an aging soldier living on faded glory. What they couldn't know, was that Nathan Ghost Crawford hadn't lost a fight since before they were old enough to hold a gun. And as he counted the distance to the nearest cover in heartbeats, he remembered why he'd tried so hard to leave that life behind. Because once the shooting started, it never ended clean. Crawford didn't move as Roland Bear Thorne and Lucas Viper Reeves approached from both sides. His mind cataloged details with the precision that had kept him alive through 100 battles. Bear's slight favor of his left leg, Viper's knife hand hovering near his belt, the way young Turner's fingers drummed nervously on his whip handle. "Gentlemen," Crawford said quietly, "I suggest you reconsider." Bear laughed, a sound like rocks in a grinder. "Or what, old man? You'll shoot us with that invisible gun of yours?" "No guns," Crawford replied. "Haven't carried one in 5 years." This gave them pause. Belle's rifle shifted slightly, her curiosity evident. 5 years? The famous Ghost, who once shot a Confederate general's pocket watch at 800 yards, gave up his weapons? That's right. Why? Belle's question carried genuine interest. Crawford's hand unconsciously touched the scar near his eye. "Because every bullet finds its way home eventually. And I got tired of watching where they landed." "Touching story," Bear growled, taking another step forward. "But times like these a man needs steel to back up his words." "I made a promise," Crawford said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "No more killing. No more guns. No more watching good men die for causes they barely understand." Belle's laugh was sharp. "Noble sentiments. But this isn't your war anymore, Ghost. This is my town." "That's where you're wrong, Miss Steele." Crawford's eyes met hers. "Every town becomes a battlefield when people like you decide who lives and who dies. I've seen enough of that to last 10 lifetimes. Bear," Belle commanded. "Teach our principled friend about the realities of Silver Peak." The big man lunged, meaty fists swinging in a combo that had dropped many men before. But Crawford wasn't there anymore. He moved like smoke, redirecting Bear's momentum into empty air. The larger man stumbled, confusion replacing confidence. "I won't kill," Crawford said, stepping away from a wild swing. "But I won't die either." Viper drew his knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "Let's see how peaceful you are with 8 inches of steel in your gut." The knife darted out, a viper's strike indeed, but Crawford caught the man's wrist. A simple twist learned in a Virginia field hospital from a Chinese medic, and the blade clattered to the dirt. Viper howled, cradling his numbly throbbing arm. Enough. Belle's rifle cracked, sending a bullet into the dirt at Crawford's feet. Very impressive, Ghost. But principles don't stop bullets. No, Crawford agreed. They don't, but they give a man something worth dying for. He turned to face her fully. You want to know why I'm here? Truth is, I was looking for a quiet place to rest, somewhere to forget about the blood and the glory and all the things men do in the name of power. And now? Belle's finger rested lightly on the trigger. Now I'm wondering why a woman smart enough to run a town needs men like these to do her thinking for her. Turner, who had been watching wide-eyed, spoke up. Belle's protecting us. The mining companies would have taken everything if she hadn't. Quiet, William, Belle snapped, but Crawford caught the flash of something in her eyes. Pride? Shame? Protection, Crawford said softly. That's what every tyrant promises. But I've noticed it's usually the protectors who end up with the spoils. Bear had recovered his balance, face red with rage and embarrassment. Let me kill him, Belle. Man's got a mouth on him. Belle's response surprised them all. The ghost is right about one thing. I do my own thinking. She lowered the rifle slightly. You've made your point about nonviolence, Ghost. Very noble. But Silver Peak isn't a philosophy debate. We have real problems here. I've seen your real problems, Crawford replied. Scared shopkeepers, a drunk kid with a whip, a doctor who remembers too much about a war everybody else wants to forget. Seems to me the only real problem is the woman holding the rifle. Belle's smile was razor thin. You've been here less than an hour. Don't presume to understand what's at stake. I understand that fear only works until someone stops being afraid. Crawford looked at Turner. Or until someone young enough to believe in heroes decides to become one. Touching sermon, Belle said, but you're still outnumbered and unarmed. Numbers didn't matter much at Antietam, Crawford replied quietly. And I didn't have a gun then either at the end. Did you know that, Doc? Mason, who had emerged from the store to watch, cleared his throat. I remember. After you got that scar, you spent 3 days helping me tend the wounded, both sides. Never asked which was which. A man's uniform doesn't tell you the weight of his soul, Crawford said. I learned that the hard way. Belle's rifle hadn't moved, but something in her stance had changed. Pretty words. But words don't feed people or keep the mining companies from squeezing us dry. No, Crawford agreed. But they might remind folks that there are choices beyond the bullet or the boot heel. He turned his back on her rifle, facing the setting sun. You won't shoot me, Miss Steele, because then you'd have to admit you're exactly what they say you are, just another vulture feeding on what's left of other people's dreams. The silence stretched like a drawn bow. Finally, Belle laughed, but this time it held less edge. All right, Ghost. You've earned yourself one night of peace, but come sunrise, I expect you to be gone from my town. Your town? Crawford glanced over his shoulder. Might want to ask them about that. He nodded toward the faces peering from windows and doorways, watching the confrontation. Seems to me they've got some opinions on the matter. He walked away, leaving Belle with her rifle and her thoughts. As he passed Mason, the doctor muttered, The boarding house has a back room. Owner owes me a favor. Crawford nodded slightly. He'd meant what he said about leaving, but sunrise was still hours away, and sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were won without firing a shot. Behind him, he heard Belle ordering her men back to the saloon, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Seeds of doubt, Crawford knew, could grow into forests of change. He just had to survive long enough to see what kind of forest Silver Peak would become. Dawn broke over Silver Peak, painting the dilapidated mining town in hues of gold and promise. Crawford sat in the boarding house's small kitchen, sipping coffee with Sarah Lynn, who had arrived early with fresh bread and whispered information. The mining company men come every month, she explained, glancing nervously at the windows. Belle's gang keeps them from taking over completely, but their demands get heavier each time. She paused, kneading her hands. Last month, they broke my brother's arm when we were short on payment. And Belle's protection doesn't extend to Chinese merchants? Crawford asked, though he already knew the answer. We pay same as everyone, but Sarah shrugged, the gesture carrying generations of resignation. Some people are always last in line for justice. The kitchen door creaked open, and Doc Mason shuffled in, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Thought I might find you here, Ghost." He settled heavily into a chair. "Had an interesting visitor last night, young William Turner, asking questions about Antietam." Crawford's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. About a sharpshooter who put down his rifle to save lives instead of taking them." Mason poured himself coffee. "Boy's got a good heart under all that bluster. Reminds me of someone else I knew before the war burned the kindness out of him." "The war didn't do that," Crawford replied quietly. "Men did that. Men who thought power was the same as right." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they watched Morgan Moe Blackwood arguing with Roland Bear Thorne outside the saloon. The saloon owner's voice carried clearly, "You can't double the rate again." "People can barely afford." Bear's massive hand wrapped around Moe's collar, lifting him to tiptoes. "Belle says prices went up. You got a problem with that. Take it up with her." Crawford started to rise, but Sarah's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Don't. Please. It'll only make things worse." "They're already worse," Crawford said, but he sat back down. "How long has Belle been running things?" 6 months, Mason answered. "Rode in with Bear and Viper right after the Big Silver Vein played out. Most folks were leaving then. Town was ripe for someone promising protection from claim jumpers and mining companies." He sighed. "Didn't realize the cure would be worse than the disease." "And the sheriff?" Sarah's bitter laugh said plenty, but Mason elaborated. "Elijah Ward keeps his star polished and his pockets lined. Man wouldn't recognize justice if it arrested him." Crawford nodded, absorbing the dynamics of Silver Peak's power structure. Belle's smart, picked a dying town, offered protection when people were scared. By the time they realized the price, it was too late. "Some folks tried standing up to her early on," Sarah added softly. "Their graves are up on Boot Hill. Belle may talk civilly, but Bear and Viper handle the disagreements." "And young Turner?" "William?" Mason's face softened. "Local boy. Father died in the mine collapse last year. Belle took him in, gave him purpose. He thinks she's building something here, protecting the little man from the mining corporations." The doctor's weathered face creased with worry. "Been trying to tell him there's no honor in—" The door burst open, interrupting them. William Turner stood there, face flushed with either excitement or shame. "Doc, it's Sheriff Ward. Belle needs you at the jail." Mason stood slowly. "What happened?" "Mining company men rode in early. There was a fight. Sheriff took a bad hit." Crawford caught the slight tremor in the young man's voice. "You were there?" Turner's eyes darted to him, then away. "Had to be done. They weren't going to listen to reason." "Reason backed by whips and fists isn't reason at all, son," Crawford said quietly. "What do you know about it?" Turner snapped. "You're just passing through, ain't you?" "Well, some of us have to live here, have to protect what's ours." "Is it protection when people fear their protectors more than their enemies?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Turner's hand strayed to his whip, then fell away. Just get to the jail, Doc. Please." After Mason hurried out, Turner lingered in the doorway. "Belle says you're some kind of war hero. That true?" "No such thing as war heroes," Crawford replied. "Just survivors who learned the hard way that violence breeds violence. But you fought for something you believed in, right? That's what Belle says we're doing. Fighting for the town, against people who'd steal it from us." Crawford studied the young man's earnest face. "Difference is, I figured out what I really believed in. Had to nearly die to learn it, but I learned." He touched his scar. "Question is, what do you believe in, William?" "Really believe in? Deep down where the lies don't reach?" Turner opened his mouth, closed it again. Finally, he muttered, "Belle's expecting me," and hurried away. Sarah watched him go. He's going to get himself killed, following her. Maybe, Crawford said. Or maybe he'll remember this conversation when it matters. He stood, placing his coffee cup in the wash basin. Thank you for the information, Miss Lynn. And the bread. Dinah May. You're leaving then? Her voice carried a note of disappointment. Belle warned you to be gone by sunrise. Crawford smiled slightly. Sun's already up. Guess I'm already breaking her law. It's not too late to ride out, Sarah pressed. There's nothing here worth dying for. That's where you're wrong, Crawford replied, heading for the door. Sometimes the things most worth dying for are the things we never thought we'd have to fight for at all. He paused. Like the right to wake up in the morning without wondering who's going to decide the price of your freedom today. As he stepped into the morning light, Crawford spotted Belle watching from the saloon's upper window. Their eyes met briefly, each measuring the other's resolve. Then she turned away, but not before Crawford saw something unexpected in her expression. Fear. Not of him, he realized, but of the choice he represented. Because every tyrant's worst nightmare was the moment their subjects stopped being afraid. And Silver Peak, Crawford decided, was ready to wake up from its nightmare. Main Street had transformed into a powder keg waiting for a spark. 8 mounted men faced Belle's gang, their horses stamping nervously in the dust. Crawford recognized the lead rider's type immediately. Expensive clothes trying too hard to look Western, a gun belt that had never seen real use. Mr. Harrison, Belle called out, her rifle resting casually across her arms. Twice in one day. We must rate special attention from the mining company. The lead rider smoothed his waxed mustache. Miss Steele, we're here about the unprovoked attack on our men this morning. Unprovoked? Turner's young voice cracked with indignation. Your men were threatening Moe's family. Quiet, William, Belle ordered, but Crawford caught the pride in her tone. She was playing to her audience, the townspeople watching from doorways and windows. Crawford moved along the edge of the confrontation, noting positions and angles. Bear's hand hovered near his gun, while Viper had already palmed one of his throwing knives. The mining company's hired guns were professionals. He could tell by their stillness, the way they positioned their horses for maximum coverage. Sheriff Ward interfered with legitimate business, Harrison continued. We're here to ensure that doesn't happen again. Ward's recuperating, Belle replied. Doctor's orders. You'll have to deal with me. Oh, we intend to. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your little kingdom ends today, Miss Steele. Either accept mining company oversight of Silver Peak or what? The question came from behind the mounted men. Crawford had circled around, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. You'll shoot them down in the street? Add a few more graves to Boot Hill? Harrison turned in his saddle. This doesn't concern you, stranger. Actually, it does. Crawford walked forward, hands empty and visible. Because I've seen this story before, different players, same ending, nobody wins, everybody loses something they can't get back. Ghost, Belle warned. Stay out of this. Can't do that. Crawford stopped in the middle ground between the two groups. Because you're both wrong. And you both know it. Harrison's hired guns shifted uneasily. Crawford's reputation had apparently preceded him. The famous ghost, Harrison sneered. Heard you gave up your guns. Not much of a threat anymore, are you? Never was much for threats. Crawford's voice carried to every corner of the street. But I am good at arithmetic. 8 hired guns, 4 local tough hands. Somewhere between 12 and 20 innocent bystanders in the line of fire. That's too many deaths for one day's profit. Profit? Harrison spat. This is about law and order. No, Crawford replied quietly. This is about greed wearing a false badge. Same as it's about protection, that's really just another form of theft. His eyes met Belle's. You both claim to be helping this town, but all you're doing is bleeding it dry from different veins. Enough talk, Harrison drew his revolver. Boys, what happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the watchers. Crawford moved like flowing water, his hands finding pressure points and nerve clusters that Doc Mason had only theorized about. The nearest hired gun toppled from his saddle, gun unfired. Another went down, clutching a paralyzed arm. Bear charged forward, but Crawford redirected his momentum into Viper, sending both men sprawling. Harrison's shot went wide as his horse reared, spooked by the sudden violence. "William!" Bell's shout carried warning, but Turner had already moved. His whip cracked, wrapping around Harrison's gun hand. The mining company man howled as his weapon hit the dirt. Crawford caught Turner's eye, nodding approval. The young man's face lit up with unexpected pride. The remaining hired guns found themselves in an impossible position. Their leader disarmed, their companions disabled without a shot fired, and a legend of the Civil War standing between them and their objective. "Might want to reconsider your employment, gentlemen," Crawford suggested. "Man who hires guns to do his talking usually isn't worth dying for." Harrison, nursing his whip-stung hand, glared at Bell. "This isn't over." "Actually," Mo Blackwood's voice rang out as he emerged from his saloon, shotgun in hand. "It is." Other townspeople appeared, armed with a variety of weapons, not all pointed at Harrison's men. "Seems to me," Mo continued, "we've got two groups here claiming to own our town, but I don't recall us selling it to either of you." Bell's expression shifted through surprise, anger, and finally, something like respect. She lowered her rifle. "Mo's right." She turned to Harrison. "You want to do business in Silver Peak? Talk to its people. No guns, no threats, just honest commerce. And if we decline, then ride out," Crawford suggested. "Before these good people decide they've had enough of others choosing their fate." Harrison looked around at the armed townspeople, his hired guns clearly calculating the odds. Finally, he wheeled his horse. "This isn't the end." "No," Crawford agreed. "It's the beginning." As Harrison's men collected their disabled companions and rode out, Bell approached Crawford. "You just cost me my protection business." "No, Miss Steele, I just showed you a different kind of strength." He nodded toward Turner, who was coiling his whip with a thoughtful expression. "One that might be worth building on." Bell studied him for a long moment. "You planned this, didn't you? Getting everyone to stand together?" "Sometimes people just need to be reminded they're stronger than their fear." Crawford winced, touching a bruised rib. "Though I'll admit, I didn't expect quite so much demonstration would be required." The townspeople were gathering now, their earlier fear replaced by a tentative pride. Sarah Lynn emerged from the clinic with her brother, their heads held high. Mason stood in his doorway, beaming like a proud father. "What happens now?" Turner asked, looking between Bell and Crawford. "Now," Crawford replied. "Silver Peak decides its own future. Whether that includes you, Miss Steele, depends on if you're willing to protect this town with its permission instead of despite its will." Bell's laugh held a new note, something lighter, almost hopeful. "You know what, Ghost? I think I'd like to see how that works." The sun had passed its zenith, casting shorter shadows on a changed town. Crawford felt the weight of years lifting as he watched people who had been enemies minutes ago begin the awkward process of becoming neighbors. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest victories came not from what was won, but from what was finally, willingly, let go. The peace in Silver Peak lasted exactly 3 days. Crawford was helping Mason organize his medical supplies when they heard the shots. 2 quick reports followed by screaming from the direction of the general store. "Sarah," Mason breathed, already reaching for his bag. Crawford was through the door before him, moving with the urgent grace that had earned him his wartime nickname. The scene that greeted them froze his blood. Sarah Lynn lay sprawled on her storefront steps, crimson spreading across her apron. Her brother knelt beside her, pressing futilely against the wound. Standing over them was Bob Harrison, The mining company man's fancy clothes replaced by trail-worn leather, his carefully groomed mustache now ragged. "Just business," Harrison slurred, whiskey on his breath and madness in his eyes. "Nothing personal. Had to show them. Had to show everyone." Belle's voice cracked like a whip. "Drop the gun, Harrison." She stood at the saloon entrance, her Winchester raised. Bear and Viper flanked her, their own weapons drawn. Turner stood slightly behind them, face pale with shock. "Too late," Harrison laughed, swaying. "Already done. Made my point. Town needs to learn." Crawford knelt beside Sarah, his hands replacing her brother's over the wound. Her eyes found his, filled with fear and something else. Apology. "Tried to stand strong," she whispered. "Like you said." "You did," Crawford assured her, feeling the life pulse between his fingers. "You stood stronger than anyone." Mason arrived, his experienced hands quickly assessing the damage. His grave look told Crawford everything. "Harrison!" Belle's voice carried pure fury. "On your knees, hands where I can see them, Sal." Or what? Harrison's gun wavered between targets. "You'll kill me? Like you killed my brother?" The revelation rippled through the gathering crowd. Belle's expression flickered. "Your brother drew first. Everyone saw it." Everyone saw what you wanted them to see." Harrison's laugh held tears. "You and your protection. My brother came to warn the town about you, about what you really were back in Texas, the bodies you left behind." Crawford felt Sarah's grip weakening. Mason worked frantically, but they both knew it was too late. Her brother sobbed quietly, whispering prayers in Chinese. "Put down the gun," Crawford said, his voice carrying the weight of battlefield command. "Enough people have died today." Harrison's wild eyes found him. The famous ghost, still trying to save everyone without spilling blood? He raised his revolver. "Sometimes blood needs spilling. Sometimes it's the only language people understand." The shot cracked across the street. Harrison staggered, his gun falling unfired. Behind him stood William Turner, his father's old revolver smoking in his trembling hand. "No!" Harrison wheezed, touching the spreading red stain on his chest. Not like this." He toppled forward, dead before he hit the dirt. In the sudden silence, Sarah Lynn drew her final breath, her hand going slack in Crawford's grip. Turner stared at the gun in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Belle moved toward him, but Crawford's voice stopped her. "Don't." He stood, Sarah's blood staining his hands, and the same hands that had once dealt death so efficiently now powerless to prevent it. "William," he said softly, "give me the gun." "I had to," Turner whispered. "He was going to. He killed Miss Lynn." "I know." Crawford stepped closer. "But now you have to choose. Right here, right now. This moment decides who you become." "I already decided," Turner's voice cracked. "I killed a man." "No." Crawford's tone was gentle but firm. "You stopped a murderer. But what happens next, that's the real choice. The gun can become a crutch, an answer to every problem. Or it can be what it should be, the last resort when all other options are gone." Belle watched the exchange, her own weapon lowered. The boy's right, Ghost. Harrison had to be stopped. "Yes," Crawford agreed. "But now William has to live with being the one who stopped him. That weight changes a person. Question is, how does it change him?" Turner looked between them, the gun heavy in his hand. Finally, he held it out to Crawford. "I don't want to be the kind of man who solves problems with bullets." Crawford took the weapon, nodding approval. "Good choice." Mason stood from Sarah's body, closing her eyes gently. "Someone should tell Mo. They were sweet on each other, though neither would admit it." "I'll do it," Belle offered, surprising everyone. "It should come from someone who understands responsibility." As the crowd began to disperse, Crawford pulled Turner aside. "You're going to remember this day for the rest of your life. The question is, what lesson do you take from it?" Is sometimes violence is necessary? Turner's voice held genuine confusion. Number. That violence, necessary or not, always comes with a cost. One that gets paid long after the shooting stops. Crawford's scar seemed deeper in the fading light. I've killed more men than I can count. Each one left a mark on my soul, even the ones who needed killing. How do you live with it? By making sure each death meant something. By working to build a world where the fewer people have to make the choice you made today. Crawford handed the gun back to Turner. Keep it, let it remind you of the weight of life and death, but promise me something. What? Promise you'll learn other ways to solve problems. Better ways. Sarah Lynn died standing up for what she believed in. Honor her by living for what you believe in. Turner tucked the gun away, nodding slowly. Is that why you stopped carrying? To find better ways? Partly, but mostly because I got tired of watching good people die while bad people argued about who had the right to kill them. Crawford looked at Harrison's body, then at Sarah's. 2 more graves on Boot Hill. 2 more reasons to find a different path. As the sun set on Silver Peak's bloodiest day since Belle's arrival, Crawford felt the familiar pull of the road, but something held him back. A sense that his work here wasn't finished. The town was changing, and change needed guidance. Sometimes, he reflected, the hardest battles weren't fought with guns at all, but with the choices made in their aftermath. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after Sarah Lynn's death dawned cold and gray. Crawford stood at her fresh grave, watching her brother place traditional offerings beside the wooden marker. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Belle, without her usual rifle. Mining company sent a telegram, she said without preamble. They're bringing in the Pinkerton agency, professional manhunters. Crawford's jaw tightened. Harrison's death gave them the excuse they needed? That, and some allegations about my past. Belle's voice held no defensiveness, just tired truth. Some of what Harrison said wasn't wrong. I did leave bodies in Texas. Not proud of it, but I can't change it. The past has a way of riding hard to catch up, Crawford agreed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Me? Belle laughed bitterly. I thought you'd be halfway to the horizon by now, Ghost. This isn't your fight. A woman died yesterday because she believed in standing up to tyranny. Doesn't matter if that tyranny wore a mining company badge or a protector's promise. Crawford turned to face her fully. So no, this isn't my fight. But it's my choice to make it mine. Even if the Pinkertons recognize you, your warranty is still active in 3 states. 4. Crawford's smile held no humor. But they'll have to decide what matters more, old warrants or new justice. Their conversation was interrupted by Mo Blackwood's arrival. The saloon keeper's eyes were red from grief and lack of sleep. Town council's meeting. Whole town's there. They're talking about surrender, giving the mining company whatever they want. Fear makes people forget their strength, Hofford observed. Especially after losing someone who showed them how to be strong. Belle's expression hardened. I won't let them throw away everything we've built here. We? Crawford's eyebrow rose. Yesterday you called it your kingdom. Things change. She met his gaze steadily. People change, if you give them reason to. They walked together to the town hall, where angry voices spilled into the street. Inside, the council members sat at their table while townspeople argued in clusters. Turner stood apart, watching with troubled eyes. The mining company's offering protection, someone shouted. Real protection, with the law behind it. The law? Mo's voice cracked with emotion. Where was their law when Sarah needed it? Better their law than no law at all. Crawford moved to the front of the room, his presence drawing silence like a blade drawn from its sheath. I've seen mining company law, he said quietly. Seen it in Colorado, in Nevada, in California, It's not law at all. It's ownership of your land, your lives, your children's futures. And what's your alternative? A council member demanded. More violence? More deaths? Number Crawford's voice carried to every corner. My alternative is standing together, not behind Bell's guns or the mining company's badges, but beside each other. Sarah Lynn died because she believed in that vision. Are we going to make her death meaningless by surrendering everything she died protecting? Bell stepped forward. I've made mistakes, used force when I should have used faith in you, the people who built this town. But Harrison showed us something yesterday. Showed us that the mining company doesn't want partners, they want slaves. The Pinkertons are coming, someone warned. Professional killers. Let them come, Crawford replied. Let them find not a divided town hiding behind hired guns, but a united community standing for itself. He turned to Bell. But that only works if everyone stands together. No more protection rackets, no more private kingdoms. Bell nodded slowly. I can't undo what I've done, but I can help build something better, if you'll let me. Turner pushed forward. I killed Harrison. That's on me. But I did it to protect what's right, not what's profitable. We all have to decide. Are we going to let fear rule us, or are we going to be worthy of Sarah's sacrifice? The room erupted in debate. Crawford watched faces, reading the shift from fear to determination in some, from resignation to hope in others. Mo Blackwood stood, his grief transformed into purpose. Sarah believed in this town, he declared. Not what it was, but what it could be. I say we show the mining company and their Pinkertons exactly what Silver Peak is made of. And how do we do that? A voice challenged. We're not gunfighters. No, Crawford agreed. You're something better. You're people with something worth fighting for, and there are more ways to fight than with guns. He outlined his plan, watching understanding dawn in their faces. Bell added suggestions, her tactical mind finding angles he'd missed. Turner's young voice contributed ideas that showed he'd learned more from recent events than anyone suspected. By the time the meeting ended, Silver Peak had found its unity, not in fear or force, but in shared purpose. As the townspeople dispersed, Bell touched Crawford's arm. You know the Pinkertons won't care about moral victories. They'll come shooting. Maybe. Crawford's hand unconsciously touched his scar. Or maybe they'll find that some fights aren't worth the cost, especially when their real employers might not want the attention. You have a plan for that too? Let's just say I learned some interesting things about mining company finances during the war. Information that might make them reconsider their options here. Turner joined them, his young face set with determination. What do you need me to do? Crawford studied him thoughtfully. You're sure about this? Could be dangerous. Sarah used to slip candy to the kids who couldn't afford it, Turner replied. Said everyone deserves a little sweetness in life. I figure everyone deserves a little justice too. Bell's laugh held genuine warmth. Well, Ghost? Ready to lead another charge? This time without your famous rifle? Crawford looked out over the town, not just buildings and streets, but people finding their courage, their voice, their unity. Sometimes the best weapons aren't weapons at all. Sometimes they're just people who've decided they've had enough of other people's wars. As they walked into the gathering dusk, Crawford felt the familiar pre-battle tension. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't fighting to kill, but to build. And maybe, just maybe, to find redemption in the process. The next 3 days transformed Silver Peak. Crawford watched from Mason's porch as townspeople fortified their community, not with guns and barricades, but with something stronger. Unity. Mo Blackwood had turned his saloon into a command center of sorts, where people gathered to share information and coordinate their efforts. Bell's men, stripped of their intimidating roles, found themselves welcomed into the community they'd once terrorized. Strange seeing Bear helping old Mrs. Chen with her garden, Mason observed, settling into his rocking chair. World's full of surprises. People can change, Crawford replied, when you give them something worth changing for. Their conversation was interrupted by Turner's arrival, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Riders coming," he reported. "About 2 miles out. Pinkertons, looks like. 6 of them, led by a fellow with a silver star." "Marshal?" Bell asked, emerging from the clinic. "Number Cordator Kikra Rayuso." Crawford's voice held grim recognition. "Augustus Reed. Used to be a marshal, now he's the Pinkerton specialist in difficult situations. You know him?" "We crossed paths during the war. He was hunting deserters then. Didn't care much which side they'd deserted from." Crawford's hand unconsciously touched his scar. "Man believes in absolute authority, he or whoever pays him." Bell studied his expression. "History there? You could say that." Crawford stood. "Get everyone in position. Remember, no guns unless there's no choice. We do this smart, not angry." The town had prepared well. As the Pinkerton riders approached, they found Silver Peak seemingly deserted. Only Moe stood in front of his saloon, wiping glasses with exaggerated casualness. Augustus Reed led his men down the empty street, his silver star catching the sunlight. Time had weathered his face, but his eyes were the same, cold as mountain snow and twice as deadly. "Quiet town," Reed observed, reining in before the saloon. "Peaceful town," Moe corrected. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Looking for some folks. Belle Steele and her gang. William Turner and a fellow calling himself Crawford these days." Reed's thin smile didn't reach his eyes, though some knew him as Ghost during the war. "Popular names," Moe replied. "Can't say I'm familiar." "Really?" Reed dismounted smoothly. "Because we have witnesses putting all of them here, along with a recently deceased gentleman named Harrison. Heard about that. Tragic business." "Tragic?" Reed's voice hardened. "Murder's a bit more than tragic, friend. Mining companies offer rewards for information. Substantial rewards." Movement caught his eye. Sarah Lynn's brother crossing the street, head high. Then Mrs. Chen walking unhurriedly to her shop. One by one, townspeople emerged, going about their business as if 6 armed Pinkertons weren't in their midst. "What's this?" Reed demanded. "Some kind of show?" "This is Silver Peak," Crawford's voice carried from the saloon's doorway. He stepped out unarmed to stand beside Moe. "These are its people, living their lives, working their businesses, making their own choices." Reed's hand dropped to his gun. "Ghost. Been a long time." Not long enough, Gus." Crawford's calm gaze took in the other riders. "Still hunting people for trying to choose their own path? Still preaching peace while others bleed for it?" Reed countered. "Harrison's dead. Mining company wants justice." "Justice?" Bell emerged from between buildings, also unarmed. "Or control?" Reed's eyes narrowed. "Miss Steele, quite a gathering of wanted folks here today." "Only wanted by people who think they can buy the law," Turner added, appearing on the saloon's roof. Other townspeople materialized on balconies and in doorways, none armed but all radiating quiet determination. "This is your play, Ghost?" Reed laughed harshly. "Human shields? Didn't figure you for that kind of tactic." "No shields," Crawford corrected. "Just people. People who've decided they won't be owned. Not by Bell's protection, not by mining company greed, and not by Pinkerton badges." "Pretty speech, but I've got warrants and guns to back them up. And I've got ledgers." Crawford held up a leather-bound book. "Interesting reading. Mining companies been cooking their books. Cheating investors, avoiding taxes. Kind of thing that could interest federal authorities." Reed's expression flickered. "Where did you get that?" "Let's just say some of us learned to fight with more than guns during the war." Crawford's smile was razor thin. "Want to see who the mining company values more? Their pet Pinkertons or their freedom from prison?" The tension stretched like an over-tightened wire. Reed's men shifted uneasily, watching the growing crowd of townspeople. Not armed, but not afraid either. You really think these people will stand with you? Reed demanded. Against legitimate authority? Already answered that question, Mo replied. When we buried Sarah Lynn, when we decided her death meant something more than profit and power. Harrison's death still needs answering for. It's been answered, Turner called down. He killed an innocent woman. The town saw justice done. Town law now, is it? Reed's voice dripped sarcasm. Better than bought law, Bell retorted. These people trusted me once to protect them. Took me too long to realize they never needed protection. They needed respect. Something your mining company wouldn't understand. Crawford stepped forward. You've got a choice, Gus. Same choice you had during the war. Follow orders that serve the powerful, or stand for something bigger, something real. Don't try to play me, Ghost. I know what you did, how many you killed. Exactly. Crawford's voice carried absolute conviction. That's why I learned there had to be a better way. These people found it. Question is, are you going to make them bleed for that choice? Reed looked around at the gathered townspeople, unarmed but unafraid, standing together not in violence, but in unity. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his weathered features. Mining company's not going to let this go, he warned. Maybe not, Crawford agreed. But they might think twice when these ledgers reach the right hands. And when they realize Silver Peak isn't divided anymore, isn't afraid anymore. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibility. Finally, Reed wheeled his horse. Mount up, he ordered his men. Nothing here worth dying for. As the Pinkertons rode out, the tension broke like a summer storm. People cheered, embraced, celebrated not a victory of violence, but a triumph of solidarity. Bell approached Crawford. Think they'll be back? Maybe, but next time they'll find the same thing, a town that stands together. On Boot Hill, Sarah Lynn's grave marker caught the setting sun, a reminder that some victories came at a terrible price. But as Crawford watched Silver Peak's people celebrate their freedom, he knew the price had bought something precious, a future worth believing in. Silver Peak's peace lasted exactly a week. The telegram arrived at dawn. Mining company forces had seized the nearby water reservoir that supplied the town. No shots fired, the Mebu. Sisteneresu, Senamblo, walked in and claimed ownership through some hastily manufactured paperwork. They're playing it smart, Bell observed as the town council gathered in Moe's saloon. No violence, just legal pressure. Crawford studied the telegram. How long can the town last without that water? Maybe 3 days, Mason replied. Less if they dam up the creek, too. The council chamber, really just Moe's back room, was packed with concerned citizens. The initial euphoria of standing up to the Pinkertons had faded, replaced by the harsh reality of fighting a company with seemingly endless resources. We could take it back, Bear suggested, his massive hands clenching. They wouldn't expect it. That's exactly what they expect, Crawford countered. They want us to attack, give them an excuse to bring in more hired guns, this time with public sympathy on their side. Turner, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What about the ledgers? The evidence of their corruption? Takes too long. Bell shook her head. Town'll die of thirst before the law acts. Crawford paced the room, his mind working through angles like he once calculated shooting distances. They're not just cutting off water, he realized. They're cutting off hope, trying to show that all our talk of standing together means nothing against real power. So what do we do? Mo demanded. Can't drink speeches about unity. No, Crawford agreed. But maybe we can drink something else. He turned to Sarah Lynn's brother. Your sister once mentioned old Chinese miners found other water sources before the reservoir was built. That true? The young man nodded slowly. Yes. But mining companies claimed those too. Calling them unsafe made people use their water instead. Show me. The next hour found Crawford, Bell, and Turner following Sarah's brother through the hills above town. He led them to a half-hidden cave entrance, obscured by years of deliberate neglect. Underground spring, he explained. Very pure. Company men filled the entrance with rocks 15 years ago and said it was dangerous. More like dangerous to their profits, Bell observed. Crawford examined the cave mouth. How long will it take to clear it? With enough people, maybe 2 days. Town only has water for 3, Turner reminded them. It'll be close. Too close, Crawford agreed. We need a distraction, something to keep the mining company focused on the reservoir while we work here. Bell's smile turned predatory. Leave that to me. They split up, Crawford organizing teams to clear the cave, Bell preparing her diversion, and Turner running messages between groups. By nightfall, the plan was in motion. Dawn broke to find Bell and her men openly riding toward the reservoir, making no attempt at stealth. Mining company guards spotted them immediately, scrambling to defensive positions. That's right, Bell muttered, watching through her spyglass. All eyes this way. Meanwhile, the entire town seemed to empty as people headed into the hills, not toward the reservoir, but to the hidden spring. Children carried small rocks while adults tackled larger ones. Even Mason helped, treating hands bloodied by sharp stone. Progress was agonizingly slow. The mining company had been thorough in their burial of the spring 15 years ago. By sunset of the first day, they'd cleared barely a quarter of the debris. Won't be enough, Sarah's brother said quietly. Need more time. Crawford watched Bell's men maintain their visible presence near the reservoir, keeping the mining company guards focused and nervous. She can't keep that up forever. They'll either attack or call in reinforcements. The second day brought disaster. One of the larger boulders shifted wrong, starting a cascade that nearly buried 3 workers. Though no one was seriously hurt, progress ground to a halt as they debated how to proceed safely. Running out of time, Turner reported, returning from another water check. People are starting to hoard what's left. Fighting broke out at the general store. Crawford stared at the cave entrance, remembering another time he'd faced impossible odds. Get me some dynamite. What? Mason exclaimed. You'll bring the whole hill down. Not with the right placement. Sarah's brother. You said Chinese miners dug these tunnels? The young man nodded. My grandfather helped. Then they'd have used support pillars. Find me the original entrance point. We'll place charges to clear debris without collapsing the structure. It was dangerous work, requiring precision that reminded Crawford of his sharpshooting days. One mistake would doom not just the operation but possibly the workers as well. By midnight, they had placed their charges. Everyone back, Crawford ordered. If this goes wrong... The explosion echoed through the hills. For a moment, Crawford feared he'd miscalculated. Then the dust cleared, revealing the cave entrance largely intact and largely clear. Their celebration was short-lived. Riders approached from town. Mining company men had recognized the sound of dynamite. They were coming to investigate. How long until spring? Crawford asked Sarah's brother. Maybe an hour of careful digging. You don't have an hour. Bell arrived, breathing hard. Company men are coming up both trails. Must be 40 of them. Crawford looked at the townspeople. Tired, dirty, but determined. He saw the same spirit that had made Sarah Lynn stand up to Harrison. The same courage that had made Turner choose justice over violence. Get everyone inside the cave, he ordered. Bell, you and your men buy us whatever time you can. Turner, take these. He handed the young man the mining company ledgers. If this goes wrong, make sure they reach the federal marshal. What are you going to do? Bell demanded. Crawford picked up a shovel. What I do best, stand in the way of people who think power means right. Without a gun? Turner asked. Someone once asked me if I really believed in fighting without weapons, Crawford replied. Time to prove I meant it. As the townspeople disappeared into the cave and Bell's men took up defensive positions, Crawford stood at the entrance. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of digging, of hope being excavated from years of buried fear. He only needed to hold out long enough for that hope to reach the surface. The mining company men arrived in force, their horses' hooves thundering against the rocky ground. Crawford stood his ground at the cave entrance, shovel planted firmly beside him like a standard of defiance. Belle and her men had melted into the rocks above, providing what cover they could. "Ghost!" Augustus Reed's voice carried clearly. He'd returned, leading the mining company forces. "Should have known you'd be behind this. Just standing in front of it, actually," Crawford replied calmly. Behind him, the sounds of digging continued. They were close to the spring, but needed more time. Reed dismounted, his silver star catching the moonlight. "Dynamite's illegal in these parts without company permission. That explosion was heard all the way to town." "Interesting law," Crawford observed. "Company permission to use dynamite, company permission to drink water, company permission to breathe probably coming next week. Still playing the philosopher," Reed spat, "while people suffer for your principles." More riders appeared from the second trail. Crawford counted at least 50 men now, retired soldiers, hired guns, and even a few faces he recognized from wanted posters. The mining company had called in every marker they had. "Last chance," Reed announced. "Submit to arrest, tell these people to clear out, and maybe nobody dies tonight." From inside the cave came an excited shout, quickly hushed. They'd found something. The spring, Crawford hoped. But they'd need more time to clear a proper channel. "Interesting choice of words, Gus," Crawford called back. "Nobody dies tonight. Remind you of anything?" Little Valley in Virginia, a lot of scared boys in blue and gray, and one sheriff turned marshal who helped me save lives instead of taking them. Reed's expression tightened. That was different. Was it? Seems to me it's the same choice. Help people live free or help the powerful cage them. "Ta-talk." One of the company men raised his rifle. "Boss says clear them out." "Wait." Reed's command cracked like a whip. "Ghost, Nathan, don't make me do this. These people are breaking the law." "The law?" Belle's voice rang out from above. "The law that lets companies steal water from honest folk? That kind of law?" Crawford took a step forward, hands empty and visible. "You know what's really illegal, Gus? Company fraud. Falsified water rights, bribery of officials, all documented in those ledgers you didn't bother to seize." A murmur ran through the company men. Reed's face darkened. "You're bluffing." "Maybe. But ask yourself, why else would they send 50 men to stop townspeople from digging in their own hills? What are they afraid we'll find besides water?" More shouts from the cave, definitely excitement this time. Sarah's brother emerged, soaking wet and grinning. "Spring flows! Clear channel." "Rifles up!" the company commander ordered. "No!" Reed's voice carried authority born of years wearing a badge. "Nobody shoots without my word." Crawford met his old adversary's eyes. "Remember what you told me in that valley. Sometimes a lawman has to decide if he's serving the law or just serving power. Time to decide again, Gus." A tense silence fell. From the cave came the sound of water flowing, of hope restored. Reed looked at the armed men around him, then at the empty-handed man before him. "Show me," he said finally. "Sir," the company commander protested. "Our orders—" "Show me the evidence," Reed repeated. "If Ghost is lying, he hangs. If he's telling the truth—" He let the implication hang. Turner emerged from the shadows, ledgers in hand. Under armed guard, Reed examined them by lantern light. Crawford watched his face change as he read. From skepticism to surprise to cold anger. "These dates," Reed said quietly. "These signatures. The water rights were never legally transferred. They've been operating under forged documents for 15 years. The company commander drew his pistol. "Doesn't matter. We have orders." His gun flew from his hand, knocked away by Bell's precise shot. Suddenly, the rocks above bristled with armed townspeople, not just Bell's men, but farmers, shopkeepers, even Mason with an ancient shotgun. "Might want to reconsider those orders," Crawford suggested. Reed closed the ledger carefully. "As a duly authorized Pinkerton agent, I am officially notifying all mining company employees that they are now witnesses in a federal fraud investigation." His voice carried the old marshal's authority. "Any attempt to destroy evidence, including this water source, will be considered a felony offense." The company men stirred uncertainty. Their commander looked around at the armed townspeople above, the determined faces emerging from the cave, and the implacable man who hadn't drawn a weapon through the entire confrontation. "Pull back," he finally ordered. "This isn't worth dying for." As the company men retreated, Reed approached Crawford. "You knew I'd do this?" "Hoped," Crawford corrected. "Believed, maybe. Man who helped save lives in that valley couldn't be completely lost to company gold." Reed nodded slowly. "Ghost. What you did here, standing against armed men with nothing but truth and courage." "Learned it in that valley," Crawford replied. "Sometimes the strongest weapon is simply refusing to believe in violence." As townspeople celebrated around the flowing spring, Bell joined them. "Think it's over?" "Mining companies will be too busy with fraud investigations to cause more trouble," Reed answered. "Ghost's evidence will keep them tied up in court for years." "And the water?" Crawford smiled. "Think Silver Peak just proved it can take care of itself." Dawn broke over the hills, painting the scene in hues of promise. Crawford watched people filling buckets from the spring, their faces alight with more than just victory. They had found something more precious than water. They had found their strength. And in their triumph, Crawford finally understood why he'd stayed. Not to fight, but to show that some battles could be won without fighting at all. A month after the water rights victory, Silver Peak had transformed. The mining company, mired in fraud investigations, had withdrawn their interests. Reed had personally escorted their evidence to federal authorities, his silver star now serving justice instead of power. Crawford stood on Mason's porch, watching the town's revival. New businesses were opening, including a proper bank that Sarah Lynn's brother would help manage. Bell had turned her protection operation into a legitimate security company, contracted by the townspeople themselves. "Planning your exit, Ghost?" Mason's voice carried knowing humor. "You've got that look again." "Time to move on," Crawford agreed. "Town doesn't need a reminder of violent days walking its streets." "What do you think you are?" Bell approached, no rifle in sight. "A reminder of violence?" "Aren't I?" "No." Turner joined them, his father's gun now worn openly but professionally. "You're the man who showed us how to fight without fighting." Crawford smiled slightly. "Still wearing the gun, I see." "Because I choose to, not because I have to," Turner replied. "Like you chose not to. Different paths, same destination." A rider approached at full gallop, one of Bell's security men. "Miss Steele, mining company president himself is coming, full escort." Crawford straightened. "Thought they were finished here." "Should be," Bell frowned. "Court injunctions." "Unless they're not coming for the town," Mason suggested. "Maybe they're coming for the man who exposed them." Crawford nodded slowly. One last test of what Silver Peak has learned. The mining company president arrived in a polished carriage surrounded by armed guards, but as they entered town, something made them rein in. Every porch, every doorway, every window held townspeople. Not threatening, just watching. Present. United. The president stepped down, his expensive suit gathering dust. "I'm looking for the man called Ghost." "Looking's free," Mo called from his saloon. "Like our water." Crawford stepped forward. "Here." "I have a proposition," the president announced. "A considerable sum to rewrite your evidence. More money than this town will see in a decade." "Not his choice to make," Bell said firmly. "Evidence belongs to the town now." Then I'm authorized to offer the town compensation, new schools, roads, developments. Strings attached, I expect, Turner added. Reasonable agreements about resource management. Like the reasonable agreements that stole our water? Sarah's brother's voice carried clearly. That killed my sister? The president's facade cracked slightly. Don't be a fool. You're nothing. This town is nothing. No, Crawford said quietly. This town is everything you fear. People who can't be bought. People who won't be bullied. People who stand together. Then I'll bury this place, the president snarled. Not with guns, with lawyers, with roads that bypass you, with railways that never stop here. You could, Crawford agreed. But then everyone would know why. Your corruption exposed, your power broken by a town that dared to stand up. How many other towns might follow that example? The president stared at the gathered faces, not angry, not afraid, just determined. Finally, he turned to his driver. Get me out of this worthless place. As the carriage departed, Bell laughed. Didn't even need guns this time. Never did, Crawford replied. Just needed to believe in something stronger than fear. That evening, the town gathered at Moe's saloon. Not to celebrate a victory, but to bid farewell to the man who had helped them find their strength. Sure you won't stay? Mason asked. Town could use a man like you. Crawford shook his head. Town has all the heroes it needs. He nodded to Turner, to Bell, to Sarah's brother. Better heroes than an old ghost of war. Where will you go? Turner asked. There's always another Silver Peak, Crawford replied. Always people who need to remember they're stronger than they think. Bell approached with a package. Town got you something. Open it. Inside was a simple badge, not silver like Reed Star, but plain brass. Engraved on it were the words, Silver Peak, strength through peace. We're not asking you to be our law, Bell explained, just accepting that you helped us find our justice. Crawford traced the words with his finger. Thank you. But I can't wear a badge? Turner smiled. Like you can't carry a gun? Or maybe, choose not to. Crawford laughed softly. Using my own lessons against me? Learned from the best. As the sun set on Silver Peak, Crawford mounted his horse. The badge was pinned inside his coat, not displayed, but close to his heart. Behind him, the town had gathered to see him off. Ghost, Bell called. Next time you find a town needing help, send them our way. Show them what's possible. Crawford touched his hat brim. Towns did that themselves, I just reminded them how. As he rode into the gathering dusk, Crawford reflected on the changes he'd seen. A town that had found its strength not in guns or gold, but in unity and justice. A young man who had learned there were better ways to solve problems than violence. A woman who had transformed from tyrant to protector. And perhaps, he admitted to himself, an old soldier who had finally found redemption not by taking up arms, but by showing others they didn't need them. The setting sun painted Silver Peak in shades of promise. From somewhere in town, a church bell rang. The same bell that had tolled for Sarah Lynn, now celebrating the town's rebirth. Crawford smiled, touching the badge through his coat. Some ghosts, he reflected, were worth keeping close. Not as reminders of war, but as promises of peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.